Right. Cool.
Take notes. So for the expand rel and window rel for the gluten folks, if I understand it correctly, they're using it via Substrate Java. So, hey, Austin, we're just talking about the first item we started. So with the window rel and expand rel being in the spec for the Substrate, if the gluten folks want to use it, I believe, actually, wait, is gluten is C++ library or is it the Java library? Is it the Spark stuff?
Java.
Yeah, so okay, if it's Java, that means that we need to pull the latest version of Substrate Java or the spec into Substrate Java. I already actually have a PR open for that, just for pulling it in the spec. And then they would have to implement support for reading in like the protos into the POJO layer in Substrate Java, and that hasn't been done yet. So I guess the first step is like update the spec, which is pretty straightforward. The second step is actually write the code to load it in. And I don't know if they're going all the way to calcite, which is a bit more code, but if they're just writing a POJO layer, that should be relatively straightforward for someone to do if they're interested in it.
Okay. Yeah, the main reason I'm asking is I know Meta is also sort of behind that, and they're sort of saying they're not interested in working further on Substrate until two things happen. One, which is that Substrate supports the physical plans, which I think specifically these two are the ones that they're pointing at. And then the other thing that they're sort of complaining about is the way that Substrate deals with, I guess, the way that consumers deal with functions. So if a function like date time has zero indexed arguments downstream, and you're expecting one indexed arguments upstream, then there's nothing that sort of converts it to that dialect for whatever consumer that might be downstream. And they see that as an issue that Substrate isn't solving. Not that they solve it themselves, but so that's the other aspect that they see why they shouldn't bother with Meta or Substrate at this point. So I'm trying to see if we can address both those issues.
Regarding physical plans, I know another thing that they've raised an issue about a few more minor things in the past, so I don't know if they still care about these or not, which is adding distributedness flags, I guess, to certain operators. So like sort has you can add a flag to it telling it whether this is the, I guess it doesn't matter as much for sort. It matters more for, well, okay. Yeah, so for sort, they wanted to add an is partial flag. I'll see if I can dig up the PR for you.
I saw that PR in the list.
Okay.
But I did not understand. I did not understand what the context behind it. But.
Yeah, it stalled a little because it has no meaning in terms of how you actually do the sort. It doesn't affect the way that you implement the sort. Its meaning is intended for a distributor / scheduler. So this is telling, like the way they use it internally is this is a flag that tells them they can only run this pipeline on a single thread. Because if it's the final sort, or I forget which one, but is partial true, I think, or not a single thread, but anyway, they can't split it across partitions or something like that. So it was more particular to the way, like it was a hint for their planner and not necessarily something that a consumer would need to care about.
Which is interesting because the plans are usually for the consumer and not for the producer.
It was, yeah, they had a component that looked at the plan to start with. So it looks at the logical plan and it adds this flag to something. That goes to another component, which then looks at the plan and figures out, okay, I have 3 input sources. Do I need to fully sort all 3 of those input sources, or can I sort each one of those input sources individually? And that's, I mean, you can see I'm struggling to explain it as it is, and the explanations we got in that thread were no better, but that was the gist of the idea. So if you read through the PR, there's a lot of discussion on it, but
Okay.
last time I talked to them, that was something they considered a artifact of physical plans. And like they were looking at that and they were saying, well, this is just how we chose to do it. And I understand that it doesn't make sense necessarily for everyone to do it this way. But this is our challenge with Substrate, is we need Substrate to be able to represent plans the way we chose to make them. So that was part of the interpretation I got for them for supporting physical plans.
It sounds to me like something that can be computed, though. It's like I could pull in the plan, I compute which things are partial and which aren't, and that's some piece of information I keep in memory.
Right, but they computed it earlier before they sent the plan across.
Isn't this what advanced extensions are, like enhancements are almost exactly about, where it's like, here's some metadata that's specific to you about how you want to execute it. You can shove it into your system.
Yeah, I think stepping back, my question for Velox, and I mean, you feel free to ignore this advice completely as needed, but I think my question there is, who is wanting to use Velox via Substrate? Like, who's the champion that's sitting down and actually writing the code to convert from some system that isn't Velox to Velox? Because if there were features the gluten, like if it's the gluten team, then I think this is a challenge they'll need to figure out anyway, because like the source of this PR came from the gluten team looking at Velox's API and seeing that there is an isPartial flag for the sort method and deciding that they need one in Substrate so that they can calculate it. But you actually have to take that question one step further and say, well, what from the Spark plan is going to determine whether or not you set isPartial, because Spark handles distributed plans in a different way.
So, sorry.
Go ahead.
So, to your question, right, there is some exploration which we are doing in this space, and essentially because Velox can bring speed up to Spark executions. Okay, my understanding is, which is different from what data speed guys, I think, were doing, Matan and others, is that Spark single stage, which is not distributed execution, that particular physical plan is converted to Substrate and then subsequently executed in Velox. Right, and at least I was not aware that even within that, like that, for the output of that should be a partial sort or partial aggregate, whatever, because it's executed on a single node. Velox is single node execution. So it's a little confusing that way, that I don't know what partial means here. But maybe I haven't looked at the PR. I can look it up and connect with what we are doing internally also as well.
Yeah, Velox has implemented thread parallelism by saying threads are kind of just like workers. And so you could implement this by, you could say, here I have a distributed plan, which is because I have all these shuffles and exchanges and things because I need to communicate across different machines. Well, you can take all of those same principles and you can move them down to the thread layer. And I believe that's where this comes from. So when they say distributed, they mean, okay, it's a single node, but it needs to read from 8 files. So I'm going to read from each of those 8 files on a separate thread. They're each going to do an individual sort. And then there's going to be a gather node at the other side of that. That's going to collect the streams from those 8 files and do a sort preserving merge, the merge step of the merge sort. And so that's, in a sense, a distributed plan, but not really a distributed plan. So when they create their plan, if you create a plan that looks like, and this comes into, there's a lot of different ways that you can create a distributed plan. So like the way that I always thought everyone used was, for each worker, you create a different plan and you send it to each worker. So that, for example, the left half side will see the plan that says scan, sort, exchange, and the right hand side will see the plan that says capture, merge. And then they'll get the two different plans. Velox has a plan representation that is before that, or which is kind of the whole stage. So they say, okay, instead of having two different plans, we're just going to make one plan, and it will be scan, sort, and then split by partition is allowed, yes, and then capture, and then split by partition, or sort, split by partition allowed, false, or something like that. So that's the way I understand it. Is that it's kind of, instead of having multiple plans, you have one plan with all these little flags that tell you, oh, this is a part that is going to be farmed out to workers, and this is a part that's not going to be farmed out to workers over here. But anyway, going back to your original point with Spark, so if we're coming from Spark single stage logical plan, something is going to have to do that smarts of figuring out, how do I split this plan across multiple files or partitions? And I don't know that that component exists. Like, I think Velox is using Presto Prestissimo in their sort of internal usage of it. So if you want to speed up Spark with Velox, you're going to have to emulate some part of Presto Prestissimo that's doing that. Okay, I have 20 files. I need to create the optimal Velox plan from this logical plan.
Possibly, from what I think we literally read the paper at work where they're doing part of this the other day. There's a whole, Spark has its own, they're not using Prestissimo. Prestissimo is the Trino thing.
Presto.
Sorry, Velox has a Presto Prestissimo Velox path.
So okay.
Meta, the way run Presto
Meta,
is
yeah.
they run,
So-
Meta runs Presto on Spark, and this Prestissimo is the glue bit. So because they use Spark for resource management and Presto for the query execution, because Presto is better at it.
This is the hot gossip you don't get from reading the papers.
I don't think papers capture this well. It is, you have to speak to them.
But I think at Meta, when you speak to them, they do talk about having sort of two paths. One is where Presto is the top layer, and the other is where Spark is the top layer. And I don't know if Presto is involved in that Spark path or not, but maybe I think it is. I think it's like Spark on Presto or something like that.
Presto
But I
and Spark,
think,
right? Or maybe, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think what they're converging to Presto SQL is what they because SQL is more. Sorry, go ahead.
The team is big fans of Presto. They are tolerate Spark because it is widespread. But anyway, so yeah, I guess that's coming back to the original statement of Substrate needs to support physical plans. I would argue the problem is not that Substrate does not support physical plans. I would argue the problem is that we're missing a planner piece, a planner component to convert from one to the other. If that component existed, then it's a simple matter of, oh, let's add the various extensions that we need, that only this particular component will use, and we're good to go.
Okay.
But like if we added in is partial today, that's not going to solve the problem at the end of the day, because when you're converting from Spark to Substrate, you're now going to run into that same question of how do I set this is partial flag from a Spark unoptimized, or the logical plan. Now the Spark physical plan does do distribution and planning. It figures out and it will turn it into a partial sort and then a merge on the other side. I don't think they call it a partial sort. They just call it a sort again. But I believe it creates. I don't remember exactly what it looks like. It's been a while since I've created that plan, but it does some of that. So maybe there's a way that you can solve this problem with Spark again, or maybe it's it'd be an interesting question, I think, for the meta team. If one of them wants to come to this community meeting, it might be good to have a kind of just a discussion on some of these topics.
That's a good point too. Okay.
Now, the gluten team, which was working with the meta team, was blocked, I believe, on just the two that you mentioned. And so now that we have those two in, I do agree that they should be able to upstream their work. It's just cautioning that I don't know that solves all their problems.
It's the ones they know about. Yeah. I just want to make sure that we make sure that particular effort is unblocked so that we can get progress, and since that seems to be important to the rest of the community.
Dialect conversion one is fun.
I think the dialect conversion, just simple level functions only, is rather simple. I'm pushing for that to be something that we work on next quarter.
Like, by dialect, do you mean like the function extension stuff, or what are we talking about here?
Being able to deal with the slight interaction problem. I mean, it comes back to all of the work that we did on trying to identify the differences between each of the platforms. So we know that this one has an N64 version of this, and this one doesn't. So if you're gonna try to send this here, you have to cast it first, or just this small differences in the way people handle the individual functions.
I have a few good examples if you want.
Okay.
The division. So if you divide two integers, some consumers will give you back a float, and some consumers will give you back an integer. So like everyone that kind of started with pandas and wanted to model pandas will take two integers and they'll give you a float. And everyone that started with Postgres and wants to model Postgres will take two integers and give you an integer. I think that was the distinction between those two. So that's an example of some of these dialect differences. The one index, zero index one that you brought up is a good one. I think DuckDB was the one that made an odd choice there, and then they've kind of walked it back.
Yeah, and it would have been nice. I would have sort of disappointed we made that an option, because I think it's up to the consumer to do that conversion. That we should have just said, this is the way it is in Substrate. All indexes are zero indexed everywhere, and then it's up to the consumer to do the conversion, or one index, I don't care. But just being consistent within.
Actually, about the one indexing problem, like what exactly is the question there? Is it like that, like the column references are 0 versus 1 indexed, or?
It often comes up in string functions. So like substring. If you say,
oh, that's gross.
Yeah, so SQL classically uses one indexing for strings. So if you say substring 1, you mean the whole string. Whereas many people will interpret substring 1 to mean all but the first character.
Gotcha. I mean, this also, I guess we've already mentioned this, but this feels like this is what the spec does. If you want your producer to be a slightly different behavior, then yeah, you offset all your references by 1, and that's on you. Because I think we need to pick one. Or do people want to be able to support both in some kind of option?
So the problem that Meta ran into is that people, again, this goes back to Presto and Spark. So there are places where Presto and Spark made different decisions. So people will write a bunch of queries against Presto, for example. Or well, in this case, they've written a bunch of queries against Spark. They have a big Spark code base, and Meta wants them to use Presto. And so they say, I can't run on Presto. I'll get different answers. Now, it doesn't have to be Substrate that solves this problem. If Substrate is sort of well defined with its semantics, then this is a problem that could be solved upstream of Substrate. If we allow all these things as options, then it becomes kind of a problem that can be solved downstream of Substrate. I agree there are sort of two different paths you could take here. I think part of the challenge is there is no good catalog of all of these differences. So that would be a helpful thing to have. I think there's a lot of fun here where people think that these issues are worse than they are. There's a lot of weird fuzzy edges around function corner cases. So like overflow will get handled in a lot of different ways. NANDs and sort of various types of illegal operations on trigonometric and floating point operations are handled in a lot of different ways, whether it's an error or it's a null or an infinity. I think there's some substrate function we have where we have like 4 different options, and there are 4 different consumers that implement each one of those different options. So I think having a good list of all of these differences will help kind of dispel that FUD. And it makes, like you said, building the actual translation is not that hard. If you have
if you know what the differences are. And we've been working on the differences that here at Voltron. We're still working on getting that repo made public. So hopefully.
A question that I have around this though, because it sounds like, I guess I'm thinking about where the responsibility for this lies. So if we as a spec decide, cool, all our indexes are serial based. So I'm a producer, I'm parsing some dialect of SQL into something, or I'm turning some plan into Velox. And I assume that I have domain expertise in, I'm building this plan. I know this system. I know how it does indexing. The spec says it's 0, my system is 0. Great, I'm good. The spec says it's 1, oh, my system is 0, I have to translate it. And then from the consumer side as well, it's very much like, I'm getting a substrate plan in Spark or in Trino, like, or Espresso, just using Trino. And it's very much like, I'm consuming this. I have a Velox plan. This is the spec. I am an expert in the system that is consuming this. When I read the translation layer, I should be like, the plan has 0 based indexing or 1 based indexing. It's like, I guess this may be specific to like the indexing discussion, where it feels like it's probably important to be able to, yes, catalog all the distinct behavior, but at a certain point, I feel like we should be able to be like, this is the behavior of, I guess overflow options are a bit like more challenging, but certain like things like what is the offset feels like 100% like a consumer and producer. Like if you're writing it, you should account for it.
And again, I think your assumption there that if you're writing a consumer and you're building the substrate adapter, you know your consumer well enough to know all of these strange behaviors. I don't think that's normally the case. For example, when people are writing a consumer and they go to adapt substrate, they say, oh yeah, my consumer has this big library of functions, and I just call them by name. Well, substrate has a bunch of names, and if we're lucky, they will map the substrate names to the appropriate names for the consumer, but they don't actually know what all the corner case behaviors are for all of the different functions. And so they just sort of say, oh, a substrate says 1 index, that's probably what we do. Or they don't even, they don't even read the individual function YAML because they're solving the problem with a broad brush, and they say, oh, problem solved. All the functions exist and can be called. But I think what you're saying is fine. And there's probably different categories of these differences. There are things like 1 indexed versus 0 indexed, which can be fixed perfectly looking at the plan, knowing the source expectation and the substrate expectation. So I agree. For like 1 index, 0 index, that probably doesn't or didn't need to be an option. Things like overflow behavior, you can't fix perfectly. You could argue, who cares? But if a consumer says, we will return null on overflow, and Substrate says, you will raise an error on overflow, there is no way that consumer can adapt to fulfill that Substrate ask, short of changing their actual implementation. Because you couldn't identify after the fact the nulls from overflow versus the nulls from just actual nulls in your data. So there's like several dimensions you could weigh each of these things on, of the who really cares dimension, whereas like 1 index versus 0 index, everyone really cares. Overflow, most people don't care. The is it fixable dimension, 1 index, 0 index, very fixable. Overflow behavior, not very fixable. And then there's just sort of the practical matter of, if you're, I don't know what the right word for this is, the who's got the most clout of, if you're the small guy in the room and you go in and you say, this is the way it is, everyone adapt to me, no one is going to change. Or the response will be, I see that you're using 1-based indexing. You need to change that to use 0-based indexing. And it's like, well, no, you can change your adapter, and I don't know. That's probably less of an actual concern, because it's.
I guess in some ways that doesn't feel. I understand the importance of working with the community on some things, but it also doesn't feel that different from. This is the default output order of columns in like a join or in like a project.
Yeah.
This is the default. Like, we don't have any names. Like, we have opinions about things that people don't like, and it's like, we could add names to things because someone has asked for it, but at a certain point we have to draw the line and be like,
yep.
I guess you're kind of stuck between the rock and a hard place of, this is a spec, it has to be somewhat opinionated at times.
Yeah, I think the important thing here too is allowing people to say, just because the spec is opinionated doesn't mean you have to propagate those opinions upward. Because there's like a long history of people coming out and saying, I've come up with the one true SQL dialect. Everyone adapt to this. I think Google did this recently. They said, I forget what it was called, but they came out and they said, we finally came up, we looked at all of our internal systems that use SQL, and they had all these crazy dialects. So we came up with one dialect. Internally, we are moving everything to use this one dialect. Everyone else should use this one dialect also, which is very different than Substrate saying, well, when you say add, or we're using 1-based indexing, and that's what we're going to use, and that's the law of the land. But that doesn't mean that you actually have to use 1-based indexing in your queries that your users are writing.
Yeah, and that's like actually the process or process work example. People like, your surface dialect can still have the indexing that you expect. You just have to know how to map it.
Yeah. So that's,
right.
I mean, coming back to Velox or Meta, the way you make them happy is by allowing their Presto and Spark people to both use Velox without noticing any behavior differences. I don't know what that equates to in Substrate. It probably doesn't really matter what we put in the spec. It's not going to solve that problem.
Okay. All right, that's probably enough on that topic. We have other things to talk about. Do you want to talk about your build failures first, since I think that's probably quicker?
I have an exciting new build failure in a Substrate Java PR around not being able to download the GraalVM thingamabob. I haven't looked at it that much. I'm not sure if there's like a token or something that's missing.
It's almost like that page doesn't exist or something. It's
Like, did Oracle change something again?
or they change, or they either were they temporarily down.
Yeah, so actually, this maybe I just need to update the action. I might be able to do this, but I guess I'm highlighting it here in case it requires someone with, I don't know, admin off of the GitHub to change something. But I can take a look at that today.
Oh, wait, okay. So this is a CI job that's failing?
Yeah, it's like the CI job for building like the Ubuntu image is unable to download an artifact.
Ah, have you tried just running it again? Or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
I've read it a number of times.
All right. Yeah, I can't load it either. It says not found. Navigate to the home page.
Okay, so it sounds like
Yeah.
no one knows what this is, so I don't think we need to spend time in the meeting. I can debug this asynchronously. I wanted to make people aware that it exists, so when I come bug you, Weston, you can be like, hey, by the way, this is what I talked about this morning.
Okay. Did the release build run this weekend and actually
It
pass?
did. It did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, we got releases all around for the last couple week or two, so that was pretty good. All right, I guess my second one. I've been trying to push along, trying to get the backlog down out of the Substrate core. There's a lot of specification stuff. There's the documentation stuff that I've been working on. So I picked a set of. One thing I've been sending out. I've been sending out the weekly. Here are the numbers of outstanding PRs in all the different core sections. Is that generally useful for people?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for doing that, by the way. That's quite helpful.
Okay. Then I guess so. Then I picked a PR, and it's like, okay, we can just solve this one actually two PRs. Then we can take something off the list. And I figure if we do one every meeting, it will help sort of get us down. So again, just trying to push down on this list. And this one's rather simple. I mean, it's just we've got the specification page has, at least the way I look at it, it looks like, oh, we've got this, or we need some sketches of what everything is supposed to look like. And this is the way we're going to put things together in the future, which generally we've figured out how the pieces are going together. And it's no longer this really early, we don't have anything designed for the system. And now we're just throwing pieces together. And we don't update these we haven't updated this page regularly or consistently either. And so a lot of things say they're draft when they're already in the system, or work in progress and they've been in for a while. So it seems like just eliminating that would reduce confusion. And so I'm due to the lack of updates, it seems like it's better to go to a point where we don't actually include add that extra detail. Weston, I think you commented on my PR about doing something more like the C++ spec, is like saying this was implemented in version 0.35 of Substrate or something like that. And my only concern is we don't update these things.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was less concerned about sort of I linked to that page not because of like here's all of the GCC versions where this particular feature got implemented. It was more that they group sets of versions into releases. So sort of like maybe that page needs to, I guess it's sort of, I added this comment to the meeting notes as well. It says maybe we're at a point where we need a 1.0 release, and we take all those items. No, okay.
Yeah,
table functions, no. Embedded UDFs, no. If you look at all of the space of SQL functionality, no, of course we don't have 1.0. But logical plans with basic operators and expressions are working very well, and people are starting to depend on these things. Take some subset of the specification, call it stable, and call it 1.0, and then say for 1.1 we're planning on adding support for table functions and embedded functions and maybe some of these other features and things like that. But what significant changes have we made to the logical, to the core functionality over the last 6 months, other than I think there's like a comment change to say that window functions, aggregate functions can be window functions, but
I think there's a set of things that we haven't clarified, right? There's still some language like map behavior. I'll get the PR out, they're just trying to remove some of the, maybe we should do this kind of statements. We've added a ton of new functions over the last 3-4 weeks, like degrees, radians, and things like that. And we're still in the process of adding those. I'd like to see more of those basic functions in for the 1.0 release.
Well, functions could be fluid and dynamic. They don't have to be associated with any particular release of the specification itself. They're extensions as far as specification is concerned.
That's true.
You're on mute, Victor.
Maybe that's off why I try to type the notes. I'm not
There
too
you go.
loud. One thing I do think that's missing from the function definitions before 1.0 is the ability to, or just the extensions, is the ability to reference functions and types in other extension files, which I think is somewhat non-trivial, but I think is it hasn't come. We worked around it by putting everything in one big file at work, and that works pretty well, at least for our custom stuff and our things working on our custom types. But in the broader ecosystem, we have someone's defined an extension full of geometric types that we might want to put in the core spec. If people want to be able to reuse those, then they need to be able to reference those.
Yeah, and I think we're working on geos. So we'll see how that comes.
So maybe going back to your original question on the rewording that page with the proposal you made was to remove the "this is in progress" language entirely.
Yeah.
Would it be, so maybe my question is this, would it be better if we instead scope it down to say, here are the remaining things that need to be figured out for 1.0?
I'm for that. If we can come up with a language for it, that I think that would be totally reasonable.
And I don't think we have a quorum in this meeting to make any kind of decision like that, but it might be a good question for the mailing list of what's missing for a 1.0 release.
And then what do we think it should be in a 1.1 release would be the second question.
I mean, we're already pretty strict on backwards compatibility. So I don't know that when it comes to the core functionality, so I don't know that a 1.0 release would be too terrible.
I guess for 1.0, it wouldn't be an opportunity to get rid of things that we don't like or that we don't want to have to support.
All the deprecated stuff is supposed to disappear in a 1.0 release according to our documentation. I don't know how much stuff that is, but that's in our guidelines.
There's a few things that are scattered throughout the proto, reserved field spots and deprecated, like the old args.
That's true.
I'll push that to the mailing list. For your PR, if we get rid of all of the wording for sort of in progress and stuff like that, I think it's misleading. Well, I guess it's not misleading because we're not saying these things are finished. It's just a table of contents, right?
Yeah, really, that's all it ends up being. Which makes you question whether you have why we have the page all, but that's another question.
Well, I mean, the original purpose of the page was here's what's remaining to get to 1.0. That was the original purpose of the page.
Yeah, I think there's one of my other PR actually has some language that you came up about. I forget what it is. Something else. It's got another section for the spec page, or for the spec section. I forget what it was. I think it was more about community stuff or the process of the process of adding new features.
There's a part of me that almost wants to add like between work in progress and commit is like usable, where like we expect that you can use this, but we reserve the right to make changes if something doesn't work the way we think it does. I may also just have some hesitation around like having never done much open source stuff. The idea of committing to a 1.0 seems like I like to make sure that things are right and not broken, or not broken, but it's like I like to be able to reserve the right to make changes, especially as I mean, in Substrate Java, I made a series of breaking changes in the last week, and will continue to do so.
Yeah, and we can't really jump to 0.9 release because we're 33 or something right now.
We got 100.
Yeah, we could do that and sort of say we're nearing the 1.0 release.
It's about setting expectations. I mean, 1.0 does not mean there's no breaking changes to the Java implementation. It means we're stabilized. There's no breaking changes to the specification.
Yeah.
So the implementations themselves are free to make breaking changes and carry on. But I get your point, which is if we're going to have a 1.0 specification, it would probably be nice to accompany that with 1.0 releases on the various languages as well. And maybe, I mean, we have really scattered language support for those helper libraries because a lot of the integrations that exist today aren't even using helper libraries.
Yeah, I actually don't think that I would couple the 1.0 of the spec to the 1.0 of the library immediately. I think it would be good. I think this is more a comment on. I've been making like big changes in Substrate Java, and I don't think there's any super huge things in the core spec, but maybe the nesting of some messages that we found are like more reusable. So like the fact that window function stuff is now used in both consistent hash rel and in the window function expression seems like maybe this should be its own thing that's reused instead of having.
We do sub message a little too much.
I think sub messaging is fine. It makes sense to me when it's like, oh, this is only used in this message, but now we have a sub message is being used like an entirely different message. It's like maybe this should have been pulled out, or maybe this should.
Yeah, and that of course changes things. I forget what language has troubles with sub messages. But yeah, so Google has some is like don't use sub messages where possible. For one particular language, and I don't remember which one it is.
All right, so how do we move forward on this PR? Do we need a to-do list? We probably don't need this to-do list for 1.0 anymore. Does it serve any use as a table of contents, given we already kind of have the navbar?
That's the question. And yeah, I'm almost for just removing this whole thing. But
I guess it doesn't hurt to have like we don't really have an index or a flat table of contents anywhere else. And the navigation on the subsite is kind of, it's not maybe as obvious. So
it is useful if somebody wanted to know what kind of features we have, then this is a quick summary of those kinds of features.
All right, I can be convincing. So I'll take another look at your PR then, and I'll think about it in that light. When I first looked at this, I was like, oh, we can't say all these things are ready because they're not all ready, but you're not necessarily saying they're all ready. You're just. I'm
saying they're not in this early draft phase anymore. Is all I'm trying to say.
Some of those features are still in an early draft phase. It's like our section for table functions just says, we got to figure this out, ...
Okay.
But most of these things are not in an early draft phase.
Yeah, and I think the other PR actually has 2 sections I wanted to add. Yeah, so that I need to adjust that too. Okay. Let's see. Richard is asking about 534. 534 is window functions because everybody loves window functions. Or There were comments, and some nitpicks that were fixed, and he fixed the particular problem. And yeah, it looks like everybody's done. It's just waiting for approvals.
Oh, adding more window functions?
Yeah.
Yeah, first value, last value, nth value, lead and lag.
Okay. I can take a look at this one today.
Yeah.
I think going back to the original discussion point of this meeting for the action for the like Luton folks who want the window function stuff, I think having more functions in, I'll get more support landed in Substrate Java for just processing, like reading in functions and simplifying that logic. That should make any implementation that they want to do with stuff easier as well.
Yeah. The what's the other thing about this? So this one only, I think, technically requires only a single approver on it, right? Because it's just adding new functions.
Yeah. And it's got
Okay.
your approval.
So it could actually go in, but
Yeah.
I think you've commented on it, so yeah, I think it's just waiting because of that. Let's see. Documentation. So I guess the question on these documentation changes. So I'm treating these documentations as spec changes. But if a documentation is, if it's a cleanup or a minor format, is that something that we should really be treating as a spec change? They're requiring two big reviews, or is that something that's more of it can do a function?
I think it's not black and white where spec ends and documentation begins all the time. But I think a large number of these would not be considered specification changes. Like the one you've proposed, adjusting that table of contents, that's not a specification change. That's just a general site change. Whereas the change that Victor had, adding a comment to window functions saying aggregate functions could be counted as window functions, that is in my mind a specification change.
Yep.
Albeit not it's a backwards compatible specification change, and it's, you know, it can go forward, but that would count as specification change. So, but I would say that just because it's in the substrate-io/substrate repository does not automatically make it a specification change.
Okay.
That if it's like a change to the site structure or, you know, navigation or something like that, then it is not a specification change.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still not clear on what that specifically means, because I can also see that this is the way we're presenting the site to the world, and thus, you know, it's it should have broader controls or something.
I mean, I think the only reason for broader controls is to make sure that multiple viewpoints are considered for changes that will affect consumers and producers.
Okay.
How we present the site to the world is very important, I think, for the success of the project. But it's not going to break integrations. You know, I think first and foremost, having something that's stable that people can rely on is important. And then sort of just down after that is having something that people can understand and easily consume and read through. But it's not quite at the same level of breaking existing integration or something like that.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm speaking a lot of just my opinion in this.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a random thought. I was just saying
Likewise.
unrelated, but I'm hoping in the next few weeks going to look at trying to create a prototype of going back and forth between data fusion and PyArrow using substrate expressions. So that's where my mind is at right now, is thinking with these expressions and how to, when I adapted the substrate to PyArrow, there were a lot of weird little curiosities. So I expect to run into a bunch more of those going the other way. Sorry, Ashwin, I cut you off.
No, I was just closing on one of the topics which Victor had started in the beginning, was that update the Java specific, just the update the submodule in Java project, and then subsequently update the Java parts, the traversers and all the code for support all the new operators. So if you need any help with that, maybe I can chime in as well on that one. That was the only offer I was making.
I wanted to also add, Preston, I also wanted to add one quick comment. It's on that page, back to that page, the specification page. It just calls out what's kind of missing or what it's in progress, type of thing. Is that a way we can say what is already working, already in the commit stage? I mean, I don't see anything of that sort listed there. So is that something we should list there in addition to what's in progress and like in the previous stages, right? So if there is something which is stable, as you guys discussing, should it be listed there as well? That way folks know what is supposed to be stable and working versus just listing out what's planned to be worked on. If we are not getting to 1.0, those kind of things, it's just showing some progress. This page, I don't know how frequently this is getting updated. Maybe that's where David is getting to. Just listening to all this discussion. Again, I don't know much, and I don't have the background. I'm just listening to these calls, recently. So I'm just a thought. Feel free to do what you feel. What do you folks feel like doing here? Just a thought.
It's a good thought. And I think that's where David was. So Jacques made a PR that said, let's update all of this and change a lot of these to commit because they're kind of ready. And then David, if I understand your PR, is basically saying, we're never going to keep this up to date. Let's just make this a table of contents and let's get rid of this whole, here's what's working, here's what's not part of things. So yeah, I think that's, I guess the question, is it valuable for people to know what is solid and working and what is still under progress?
Yeah.
And maybe that just means we have lighter language around it. It's just in progress and not in progress, and is the other way of going about it.
Yeah.
Which would be an intermediate approach to just nuking the whole section.
It's a nice way to say that how mature the project is. I think I like the idea a lot. It's a good suggestion.
Yeah. Thanks, folks.
All right. So yeah, maybe David, going back to your original PR, if we could at least take the things that we know are wildly undefined and pull them out into a second section. Maybe we can just have two sections of sort of, here's the table of contents of the major features that are well defined. Here's the table of contents of features that are still in progress.
Okay, I can do that easily enough. See, I have a question about recordings. So I see that the last recording we have is May 24th. Is there like a place where we get all the recordings, or
the person that can answer your question just dropped. Shoot a message to Ashvin on the Substrate Slack.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, it'd be nice to, yeah.
Microsoft is hosting, these calls. So
Right,
they
and
get
so
all the
it's-
recordings.
Right, and so all the links are yeah, they're going to them probably in individual messages, and they're not in any, here are all the recordings for this particular meeting, which would be really nice. Because then we could expose it and say, okay, here are the list of all the meetings, and put them on the website. But we don't really have a comprehensive list. Okay.
All right, I think Ashwin could get that to you, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay. All right. That's the other thing I was sort of thinking about. Trying to get the calendar and the recordings. This is one of the things I've been thinking about. And I need some information, I guess, from Philip, who owns the meeting invite or something like that, in order to get the calendar invite up on the site, because it's got to be made public and some other stuff.
Oh, the calendar itself?
The calendar, yeah.
Oh, we all have.
Yeah, I think it's
whatever
the
permissions.
calendar itself. I think it's the
Okay.
calendar's the problem.
I can
So,
add you to that.
Okay, and maybe that'll be enough. All right.
And then David, one last thing is in that community page, you can add, like if you want to add the bi-weekly meeting invite in agenda and all those things. I don't know if that's something.
The
can
agenda
be added.
is the hardest. The link to the link to the invite is what I'm hoping to have, so you can always see here's the next Substrate meeting and click on it and add it to your own calendar. That's the part I'm trying to share, which means you would have the link to the agenda from there. A link to the doc, maybe. I haven't thought about that. Because usually the agenda isn't updated far in advance. I'm not sure that it'd be as useful. But yeah, definitely having access to the calendar invite and the recordings, I think, is probably useful to try to get people included. It'll link to the agenda doc might not hurt, but if you got the calendar invite, you also have the agenda. So we'll see how it looks. We'll see how it looks.
All right. Okay,
I think
I'll
that's it.
get your name added to that.
Thank you.
See you, everyone.
All right.
Yeah,
Bye,
thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.